I'm so thrilled today to be sitting with two of my dearest friends. We've become friends through a multiplicity of avenues, through theater, through childhood, shared cousin and friends and all those things. But where we come together today is as survivors of sexual assault as children. And we want to talk about the healing journey today. So as we focus on, first of all, welcoming Dave Markel, our trauma-informed interview specialist and my co-host to the show. Thank you, Dave, for being here.
It's a pleasure, Jen. It's good to be back again with you.
I love having Dave here because, he's a dude. And so Alan here, who's also a dude, I think they feel more comfortable maybe being supported by each other in talking about that healing journey, that pivotal moment when you knew that you needed to actually look at what happened to you, right?
Sure.
So I'd love for Dave to help me guide this conversation of healing, but let's go back with Alan to maybe your pivotal moment and what you were doing, where you came from, and what was it that led you to knowing you needed to be on a healing journey at all?
That's a great question. And as you sort of pointed out at the beginning, it is different for pretty much everybody. I think everyone has a different point in their life when they come to the realization that it's probably a really good thing to start dealing with these issues and to begin some kind of a healing journey, not even really knowing what that's going to be like when you start. Mm-hmm. For me, it was at a time in my life when I was dealing with some really serious health issues and dealing with some really serious marriage issues, where I was realizing that I was not accessible enough, or I was not doing a really good job of being a good partner and opening myself up as well as I probably should have been to being in a good marriage, and that that part of that was because of my inaccessibility for intimacy, I think, to a large extent. Mm-hmm. So for me personally, again, I had a very serious health issue I was dealing with, and that began a chain of my doctors saying, "Hey, Alan, you really ought to deal with these other issues you've had to deal with in your life as well." And as many male survivors, I think, have experienced. And I'm only speaking from my perspective. I'm sure that this is across the board and female survivors as well. We just tend to take a really long time before we're willing or able to really start a journey. And you hear all the time about people that wait till they're in their 40s or 50s. I was in my early 50s when I first started my journey, and so it had been 40 years. From the time, I had experienced these things until I actually started a journey to address them, to try to heal.
So you were about 11, 12.
I was 11 and 12 when my experiences happened. And to put a little bit of context without going into the details of the story, that's not what's relevant today, is, I was, my sixth grade teacher was a former priest, and heaven knows why he was then a sixth grade teacher, but that's the way things sort of worked back in the mid 70s. Mm-hmm. And so you can just take it from there. One day we'll share the details, or not the details, we'll share more of the story and focus on that. But today let's focus obviously on, as you framed, on the healing journey. So it had been 40 years. Yeah. So 40 years later, and apparently that's not that uncommon. I had probably told less than a handful of people that I had actually experienced those things before I started to actually address them and work with professionals to try to start a healing journey, which at the time I felt was important to provide me with the ability and the opportunity to be a better partner and a better husband, a better partner in life, and to open myself up more to what a real intimate relationship really should be like, if that makes any sense.
That makes a lot of sense. Dave, does it make sense to you?
It does, but it also begs some questions, Alan, in my mind, especially where your trauma was concerned. And I'm wondering, when you were first confronted with this idea that you needed to address your past issues, and you hadn't for all those years, you get told, hey, we really need to have you start working on this. Can you help us understand how that made you feel with regard to seeking some sort of support in that? Or contrary to that, did you feel like you were all alone in that search for expressing those issues and trying to find your voice?
And that's actually a really good question. I've never really thought about that. But when you're asking that, my reaction to that is that I was actually relieved at being asked, if that makes any sense, or relieved at the possibility of being able to actually deal with them, deal with the issues, because I'd felt like, yeah, I've come to a point in my life where I can see that my inability to, to be a good partner with somebody is actually profoundly affecting my life, profoundly affecting other people's lives, obviously. And it was almost sort of like a relief to be able to start finally figuring so many different things out, if that makes any sense. And so I sort of embraced the idea of really trying to figure out how to move forward and starting a journey. I immediately started looking online to try and find a bunch of resources of groups or therapists or group therapy groups to turn to start dealing with it. The first thing I did was to go see a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist that I met with about 2 times initially, and my big question to him was, what does it do to your brain? What does this do to your brain? I kept on I'm trying to figure out why my brain works the way it does sometimes, why I have, issues of not being able to probably do intimacy very well and things of that nature, and so on and so forth. And so that was my big question with the psychiatrist, was, what does it do to my brain? And his, response was, it does an awful lot to your brain. And that's worth exploring. His ultimate recommendation to me was continue with talk therapy, continue with therapy. You don't really need any medication. You just need, to do talk therapy to work through all of this. I did that. I'd already started in the meantime doing that too. He said, just continue with that. I still went back to him one more time about maybe a month or so later, on my own volition, because I sort of kept on wanting to get that question answered of, what does it do to your brain? I need to understand more about what it does to your brain. But in answering your question, Dave, I mean, it was sort of like I really sort of embraced the once I had the opportunity to deal with these things, I sort of embraced it and really sort of dived into it.
Did that embracing of that idea of finally confronting this kind of threaten you in any way, in terms of realizing, hey, I've got this trauma and I don't know what to do with it? Help me understand what that correlation was between the relief you felt and the trauma you had been feeling.
That's another good question. I think that I think for me, I was afraid, to revisit a lot of things, and so I was afraid to revisit. I was afraid to go back there, if that makes any sense. But at the same time, I I felt some kind of relief for the ability to try to figure some things out, and to try to figure out, why some things in my life had gone the way they'd gone, why things were always so difficult in certain areas of my life, and things like that. And so while I, was afraid, I was also sort of relieved and eager, if that makes any sense, to try to figure a lot of things out.
So was step one then, after you talked with a psychiatrist,
Right.
and you're eager to move into that journey because you can see here's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, 500 problems,
Right.
that you're experiencing, and you're like, why do I react this way? Why don't I react in another way? I'm dealing with medical issues. What was it that codified the step 2, 3, 4? What were those next steps that you took so that you would keep moving forward, because you are still involved in that healing journey?
Sure. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very much still involved. I think, and that's a great question too, because exactly. I think that what kept me going, and what gave me the ability to want to keep going in that journey was, well, I should preface this by also saying, when you first start out dealing with all these things, you can't, for me, I couldn't even talk about it without getting really emotional. I couldn't even start a conversation about, what had been going on or what had happened in the past, so to speak, without crying. Without getting, really emotional about it. And it took about a year before I could actually have a pretty matter of fact kind of conversation about the situation without, becoming so emotional that you can't talk about it.
So it's interesting that you say it took about a year, because it took enough times talking about it with all the emotion to get it outside of the body, so that then you could kind of examine it without so much of the mind or the emotions getting involved. And I think that's a really interesting thing for people to remember, that you may still have many emotions for a year, for 2 years, for 10 years, but you are getting it outside of your own, the interference in the body, so that you can now kind of become your own physician in a way of looking at it.
Yeah. And that's a really good point, because it does take that time to sort of get that out, so to speak, and to feel comfortable to be able to express yourself in a way that you can do it much more matter of factly, as opposed to always, being so emotional about it. And I think that, but I think that the first steps were, I got in touch with a male survivor group, and was lucky enough to then be able to go into a group therapy with that group on a once a week basis. We met on Tuesday evenings at a therapist, Jim Struve, who's the head of, or one of the heads of men's healing group. And he had a group at the time that was meeting once a week on Tuesday evenings. And it was limited to 8 people. And I was just lucky enough to sort of wanted to start my journey as somebody else was sort of graduating, so to speak. So I got that slot. And so once a week, we would sit down with each other, and with Jim there, we would go through our therapy. And so for me, the first step of wanting to continue, I think, was being part of a group of other men who had experienced things similarly, and finally realizing that you're not alone, and you're not alone. That that you weren't the only person to experience these things, and that you're not crazy or stupid for having had these things happen.
Yeah, that's just a huge thing that feels like that common bond when you step into a space where others have gone through it, and
Right.
not feeling alone is like huge for a survivor.
Huge.
That community.
Huge. And then the second step, there's, one of the other first steps was that Jim asks you when you first start this program, this process, to write your experience and to be able to write it. And that was really hard for me. I don't know why. That was really hard. It took me, 5 or 6 months before I could actually finish, what I would call part 1 and part 2. I never really got around to finishing part 3 or part 4 yet. so anyway,
you're still on the journey.
I'm still on the turning point. Exactly. But in writing things out and in thinking things through, that also is so helpful, because one of the things that it did for me was reminded me of how the process for me, at least my situation, was I was so meticulously groomed. And realizing that grooming process that I went through had been set up by all these previous experiences in my life that sort of landed me into a situation. And I'll use the example that, obviously, as I mentioned, my abuse was at the hands of a 6th grade teacher and his sort of cohorts in crime who had been his previous students or parishioners or whatever, and was very focused on you're a special student, you're a special student, blah blah, so on and so forth. And as I look back in my life, my mom was a dorm mother at a university when my father first taught, and so as a really young, as like a 3 or 4 year old kid, I was surrounded by college students who just adored me and doted on me all the time, and so on and so forth. And so that's just one example of how I had been so used to that kind of thing that when the abuse started and I was sort of drawn into this sort of web of grooming, that college student age people doting on me was very familiar and very normal in my life and from my experience. That's one example of when I was writing out my experience and connecting all these dots, that I could sort of see how these previous, experiences in my life lended themselves to being able to be so easily and meticulously groomed. And I guess the reason that's important, I guess the reason that's important is because, as most survivors will tell you, I think, at least from my experience, is that at least when I first started out my healing journey, one of the things that I identified as one of the things I felt would be a goal, if you want to call it. And again, when I started out my healing journey, I had in my mind that you can heal from this and that you could figure this out and it would all be figured out, which is just not true. It took me a while to figure that out. But anyway, but one of the biggest things that I had always felt for my healing journey would be so important is for my intellectual understanding and my emotional understanding of the fact that it's not my fault to come together. Because, you can have people tell you ad nauseum, it's not your fault. You were, 11 and 12 years old and so on and so forth. And you can intellectually understand that's true, but that's not the way you feel. You always feel this sort of this blame to yourself. You feel this, like you're partially responsible and you're complicit and so on and so forth. And you feel all these things. And so as many times as people say, it's not your fault, it's not your fault, you always feel like, well, yeah, it sort of is. And Anyway, in doing my writing and sort of seeing some of these things in my life that he had even set up, how it was so easy to get groomed in the way I was, I began to understand, yeah, it really wasn't my fault. And I really, it wasn't really, that helps gap that intellectual and emotional understanding of the fact that it's not your fault. That was huge too.
That Bessel van der Kolk book, The Body Keeps the Score. And I'm wondering if through what you're describing and your experience and realizing that you needed to write this down and be involved in this group where I'm making an assumption you felt a feeling of inclusivity and safety in that group. But as you think back on those times when you were writing and thinking and processing all this, can you help our listeners understand? Because I'm sure there's several who have similar feelings and experiences like yours. How did that all make you feel physically? What kinds of impact did this have on you?
Well, that's an interesting question. As far as the impact on how it made me feel physically, I honestly don't know if there was a real impact between the writing and the and my physical way I felt. I know that during that whole process, when I started writing these things and things of that nature, I was beginning to feel more physically healthy for several reasons. Number one, I was regaining some health with some issues I've been dealing with that. But I think the way that the writing made me feel in general, and I'm sure that there's a physical component to this as well, is it made me feel stronger. And it made me feel more whole. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does.
I haven't really thought about that very much, but
very interested in that.
Yeah, it made me feel more stronger and more whole, I guess, would be my initial thought process in terms of how it made me physically feel, because it also made me emotionally feel that too. But there is such a correlation, as you're referencing that book, The Body Keeps the Score. There is a real correlation between how your body feels in relationship to thinking about and dealing with that abuse from the past.
I'm surprised you haven't brought up once a feeling or a thought of anger or frustration. Yeah, but those types of emotions generally have some sort of physical expression and release. And I'm just wondering if any of that was part of your experience of
absolutely
getting to the steps that you and Jan have just been discussing, that step 1 and step 2. Where were you with all of this?
Yeah, now that's a really good question. And now I understand more about what I was thinking in terms of the physical from like just sort of the healthy physical as opposed to the physical expression of things.
But that's interesting too. I mean, it's awesome that you were able to channel some of that into this feeling of, wow, I'm actually making some headway here, both physically and emotionally.
I was saying, Dave, yes, Dave, there's absolutely a physical expression component to this healing process that I went through for sure. If you ask the guys that were in my group that I've been working with, for now 7 years about, roughly, they kept on saying, Alan, at the beginning, it's okay to, express your anger. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to express that and to feel that. And we all grow up in these environments where we're sort of taught that's not what you do, and you don't express anger. And I I've my whole life been a pretty easy-go-lucky kind of person. I'm not, I'm not one who gets angry easily at all. I don't get angry hardly at all. And so for me to get angry was really unfamiliar and uncomfortable. And I didn't feel good about that. But I definitely became angry and about thinking about all these things that had happened, and became angry about just all that stuff. And so that was definitely one of the physical expressions that manifest itself. The other part of those kinds of physical expressions, I think, is you become angry, and you also, I mean, from a sort of physical expression part, you get pent up in your inability to forgive, and not just the perpetrators, but yourself. And I think that there's actually a physical manifestation of that too, of the angst that you feel and the angst that goes through your body when you're in this huge conflict of, I can't let it go. I can't figure out a way to not have it have this hold over me, as opposed to being able to release it. And I think there's a physical manifestation and an expression to that as well, that I certainly went through. I continue to go through. I haven't quite gotten to where I want to get in that area. And I think that's a very physical expression and manifestation as well of these.
Absolutely. How does that correlate then with your social relationships, your family relationships? You've got this, this kind of conundrum going on in your head about feeling that anger, feeling that angst, yet at the same time, because of what you just said, you weren't brought up to be that way. It wasn't in your personality to be that way. Help us understand how you kind of balanced that and worked through all that. That's just part of that step that I think that we're talking about here, is in coming, bringing all this to the surface and being able to talk about it, is dealing with those emotions and physical feelings.
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, I'm still trying to balance those things. I'm still trying to work through those things. Absolutely. And I acknowledge that, because that's really hard. And something that I even still today personally feel that I haven't done as good of a job with as I should. And I think that it is so hard to be angry and not want to be angry. And it is so hard to try to figure out how to let things go without sort of this attitude of like, oh, it didn't matter, or what they did was completely, I hate using the word forgivable or whatever, but but it's really hard to figure out how to do that and how to balance those things, because it's really this internal, as you said a little while ago, conundrum, where you don't know how to be true to yourself and your feelings of complete betrayal, of complete horrificness, and your desire to not be consumed with anger and bitterness and unforgivingness and all of those things. And I think that it really does affect not just how you feel about your experience as a kid in looking back, but it also projects itself onto your other relationships with your family and your friends and all this kind of stuff. And it's really hard. I mean, it is super hard. I think that for me personally, one of the things it has done is made it more difficult to not project anger at my parents specifically in completely unrelated issues to my abuse as a kid, in terms of how they treated me and how they, parentization process in my life that occurred, which was unrelated to my abuse, although I'm sure it contributed to the grooming process that was able to happen. And I mean, so for me, it was, and still is, a real challenge to not have that continue to project and not have that continue to be a real struggle of trying to find that balance. I'm still trying to find the balance.
And don't you feel like there is a definite correlation, though, to being in a community that understands all of that conundrum of feelings?
Yes.
That is one of the most beneficial parts of being in a community.
It's got to be empowering, I'm sure. Because Alan, I look at your life and I see your relationship with myself and with Jen and those around you. You know, we've got a working relationship, we've got a friendship relationship, we've got, so many different layers. You're amazing. What's your message to those who are listening, who are fighting some of those same issues that you just related to us, in terms of that conundrum, the anger, the ire, the frustration, yet you're handling it so well, at least on the surface? You've got to have a message, I'm sure, to these listeners who are going, yes, I feel that too, Alan. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Oh, wow. I guess my message would be, number one is, I am so lucky. I have felt so blessed and lucky in my life for always having an understanding of the love of my Heavenly Father, and of my acceptance from Him, no matter what. Because I feel, or I know, or I have this understanding that He knows my heart. And that because He knows my heart, it's okay. And I feel like I have been profoundly blessed with the understanding of that in my own soul, my own life. And that has been the constant that has given me the ability to move forward and still look at the world and still look at life from a positive, good, I'm in a learning process way, as opposed to everything is so terrible and horrible, and all these things. And that's a very honest answer.
It's an amazing answer, Alan.
And
I think,
answer.
Jan, I'm going to kind of throw this at you too, as from your experiences. I think this speaks to both of your journey of resilience. And I think I want to emphasize at this point the message that healing and recovery is so possible. I look at both of you and I'm just in awe.
The sense of that things will get better, and that you often turn to, okay, just tell yourself it's going to be okay. Even if today it feels like I'm going to rip, my hair out, or somebody else's, if you just can come back to having that hope in a better day, in a better feeling, you can reach for just slightly better feeling. I one time learned from a friend about this tone scale, and it's like you can't go from despair to joy. You go from despair to maybe revenge. That might be a better tone, and then from there you reach to something a little higher, and you have to build back. And that's an exercise in resilience. And I know that Alan, with his, and we haven't even gotten into that, and we'll maybe do a part 2, some of the books that he's read, that I've read, that has helped me tremendously. Some of the other people that I've been able to watch what they've done with their life, whether it's Oprah Winfrey or it's another person that I know had a similar situation to mine. Getting to know Alan's story, your story, Dave, all the other stories that are coming to me helps me to be able to sort and sift through my own emotions about my own story, and how to realize that my emotions are just fine the way they are today, and that they will probably change within the hour. And that's part of this journey of healing. It's not all going to be just a very smooth, trajectory, just ride up, 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 up. No, it's a roller coaster ride, but that the roller coaster on this emotional moment is going to end. The ride's going to come to an end. You're going to be able to go, whoa, I lived through it. What can I learn from that particular emotional journey? And it will happen again, but maybe in a slightly different way. You never take the ride the same way at any point. And I think that is what people need to know, that it is possible to heal. You may have a scar, trauma comes from the word, it means wound. And so you're going to have a wound, but if you keep it gaping open, and you keep fueling the wound with all the wrong things, it's never going to heal. If you do, that's why you dig in and you do this work, because you get to age 51 for Alan and you go, something isn't working in my life. I better do this work, as painful as it can be, as angry as it can make you, as despair sets in. All of the things that come to you through this healing journey, you go, why did I ever bring it up? Why did I want to look at this trauma? What was the purpose? The purpose is you're trying to get the bullet out so the wound can heal and leave a scar, but it can heal. That's what Alan's talking about, I think.
Well, and it is work. I mean, it is work.
Yeah.
And I mean, I remember like 2 or 3 years into my individual therapy kind of stuff, having this sort of, light go on in my head, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this actually works. I mean, therapy actually works. And I was, saying to my therapist, her name is Carol Story. She's incredible. And anyway, I was saying to Carol, oh my gosh, this actually does work. And she's like, yeah, it does. And she said, it's also because you are willing to do the work. And my point of that is that it is a lot of work. I mean, it is a lot of work.
Well, and Jan just alluded to that it is that roller coaster, but you're going to have really bad days and some really good days too. And it makes me think, Jan, do you remember talking to R.C. Gray? And she calls those really bad days those craptastic days.
Craptastic. Yes. I love that. Craptastic.
Yeah.
And I also think that people often are like, why would you bring it up? Most people want to hold, they want their head in the sand because they feel like if they bring it up, it's going to make things worse, but it doesn't. It may be worse for a minute as you get through some emotion, but in the long run of it, you have a much better quality of life, much better relationships. We're going to leave and go to Alan's little boy who's 9 years old and playing a baseball game, and we're going to go to that. And all of a sudden you go, here's the joy. Here's what getting through this has led me to, whatever that is for you, fill in the blank. And it is better to go through it than try to avoid it, because that doesn't work. Right. And we know it
doesn't work.
That's why we
Yeah. And I think for the future, Jan, it would be really interesting to talk to both of you again, to co-host with you and talk about the differences between what you went through and what Alan went through, because of the differences between being a female who's been sexually assaulted and being a male who's sexually assaulted in our society, and those stigmas and those kind of mindsets that males don't get raped, males don't get sexually assaulted. We can talk about that in the future, right?
And Ben and I were just talking about that as I drove him home from our strategy session about the differences in stigma and things like that in society.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But anyway, we got
to head out right now.
Off.
But thank you to both of you for being here for this part 1 of an episode that we will continue and talk about exactly those things, Dave. And we can't wait to be on this platform again together to do more of that.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me be a part of it.
So
thank you, Alan.
Dave,
thank you, Jan.
Dave, I just got to tell you, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you as a person, but I also can't tell you how much I appreciate you as a co-host with Jan. This works for me. And just so you know, I mean,
I appreciate you saying that, and I'm glad I could be here for you. It makes me feel great to know that you feel that way. Thank you.
I do.
Thanks to both of you, and we will see you on the other side.
See you on the side.
Thanks, Jan.
Okay, bye.